And desire is very much associated with the concept of attachment. Um, but we're gonna try and focus primarily on sort of the craving aspect of desire. And as I was preparing for today's talk, I found that this topic was just so huge. So what I'm going to try and do today is just an overview information, and um, probably break off some elements of today's talk and do a more deeper dive at some future time. When you think of desire, many things can come to our heads, to our minds, but one of the things I want to focus on is sort of this message, this underlying message from advertising, from friends and family, from TV, movies, that happiness comes from having all that you desire. There are ads that say, don't let anything get in the way of your desires. That somehow being able to have everything you want, everything you dream of, will make you happy. And yet, when we look at examples of the 0.1% richest people in the world, we see that they still suffer. They still are unhappy. Many of you may say, well, I want that kind of unhappiness. But the truth is that we can achieve, at the very least, a significant reduction in our suffering, if not happiness and peace, if we become more aware of what desires do, what desires create. And so we'll talk a little bit about the Buddhist perspective on desire today. When we look at the definition of desire, desire is a longing for something. It's synonymous with craving, with lust, with want, maybe even need. And we'll talk a little bit about wants becoming needs. If we look at the Pali translation of the word for desire, it comes from the word tanha, which has its root in the word that means thirst. So when we say desire or craving, which I will use interchangeably in this conversation, it has that element of thirst, of longing, that there is something that I have a discomfort that I'm trying to alleviate, or that I want to alleviate with something. So that's the narrowing down of what I will be focusing on today in terms of desire or craving. And one thing that I want to point out as you are listening to this talk is that there are varying degrees of desire. We have from, it would be nice, or I would like. You could say, I want, I need, or even go, I really have to have it. So we have varying degrees of desire, varying degrees of craving. What I will be talking about is that if we can stay on the lower range, the range that says, it would be nice or I'd like, there is a openness in that element, in that range, that you start losing once you start getting to the I want, I need, and I must have range. And I also want to put as a caveat that we have to be careful and remind ourselves that while we may have been taught in our early age that desires or certain desires are bad or evil or sinful, Buddhism doesn't really approach desire from that judgmental perspective. In fact, it's not against desire at all. It's simply asking us to find the middle way, to find a balanced approach to desire, so that you're going to have desires. You're going to be hungry, and you're going to want to eat. That's just how our bodies work. you're going to thirst. Okay, so for Buddha to say that desires are bad would be equivalent to saying that the body is bad or the body is broken or malfunctioning. And that's not what Buddhism is telling us. So desire does not equal bad. It does use terms such as wholesome and unwholesome, but it's not as clear cut. So the terms wholesome and unwholesome are more of an aid, a guide to help us understand. But we don't have in Buddhism anything that says this behavior is always bad. And you'll see that even the longing for enlightenment, the longing for nirvana of Buddhism, can in itself be unwholesome. So we'll talk a little bit about what it means by wholesome and unwholesome. When we're talking about wholesome desire, and since those are not very problematic, I won't focus too much on that. Wholesome desires tend to be non-ego driven, so they're not as selfish, or when the self is considered, it is in balance with the other. And so that's the middle way. If you're selfish only, that's bad. But if you're other focused only, that's also unhealthy and unwholesome. So you balance, when you can balance the self-focus with other focus, that's the middle way. So that's a quality of wholesome desire. Okay. And while the unwholesome desires tend to be more me, right? I want to satisfy my need. So it's very ego driven. And in general, we can divide these unwholesome desires into sensual pleasures and cravings for becoming. Let's tackle the sensual pleasures first, since that's what we most think about when it comes to cravings. And so from the Buddhist perspective, the desire to experience pleasant sights or smells or tastes or sensations in the body, or even pleasant states of mind, that desire is that craving for sensual pleasures. Sensual means senses, not necessarily sensual in terms of sex or romance. So sensual being about the senses. And that in Buddhism, in addition to the five senses that we typically think of when we think of the word senses, sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing, Buddhism also considers the mental formations or our thoughts to also be a sense. So whenever you hear senses discussed in Buddhism, it usually includes also our thoughts. So seeking pleasure through the senses is that sensual craving, that sense craving. It is, our bodies are built to pay attention to whether something is pleasurable or unpleasant. So pleasant or unpleasant. And at the very early stages of our lives, we can at least categorize things in terms of pleasant and unpleasant. You don't have to be very intelligent. You can be a newborn baby, and you can start having this distinction between pleasant and unpleasant. I was just in a very nice warm womb, and all of a sudden I got pushed out, and I am in a cold room, and there I'm being assaulted by all these noises, and I'm going to cry. So at that very primitive state of our being, we can distinguish pleasant and unpleasant. But the appeal of sensual pleasures, of pleasures of the senses, is that it tricks us into believing that once I have this pleasure, I'll be all right. Okay? So we have this cycle, this samsara is what Buddhism calls it, this cycle of constantly seeking out the next pleasure. Because if this pleasure didn't do it for me, the next one will. If this pleasure wasn't enough, then I just have to get a more intense pleasure. So we get into this almost like a cycle of addiction with our sensual pleasures, our sense pleasures. And here's some examples of things that are not in of themselves traditionally considered bad things, but are examples of us craving sense pleasures. Coffee in the morning. For many of us who are coffee drinkers, and I'm not a coffee drinker, but I have seen what happens to some of you when you don't have your morning cup of joe. That is a form of sense pleasure that started off simply with, oh, it's okay. It doesn't taste great, but it's not bad. Oh, I like this feeling of energy it gives me. And you went from, barely drinking half a cup to drinking a cup to drinking more than one cup. You went from really sweet and sugary and a lot of cream to just having it black and thick. And so that analogy of the coffee is a really good one to help understand what happens with our sense pleasures. That we start off with a little bit and we kind of like how that feels, and we get more, and we kind of like how that feels, and we just keep on going with more and more until it can reach a level of an addiction, or even an obsession. Okay. I think we have seen people in our lives who are obsessed with coffee. So it can get to a point of an obsession. Now, drinking coffee in and of itself is not an evil or unhealthy thing. And that's why I wanted to use coffee as an example. It's not the drinking coffee that is causing problems. It's what you are doing with the feelings that arise from drinking your coffee, and what you're doing with the feelings and discomfort when you don't get your coffee. Right? So that's the sense pleasures. Okay. Another example would be another one that's not a bad or good thing, is just a part of the sense pleasures. When you're hot and you are just really hot, and it's a hot San Antonio summer, and you just are longing to finally be in the AC or in front of a fan. And when you finally get there, oh my God, it's so hot out there. And so that is a example of how, and I'm going to use that example again, of how our senses can create some suffering for us. Okay. And right now it's not too clear with the fan example, but it will be. I'm going to talk a little more about that. Okay. One of the things about pleasure is that it can make us fall into the trap of thinking that more of what that is causing us pleasure will make us happier. And when that doesn't work, we'll say, well, maybe if I have a little more. So it sounds almost like a drug. We think about, for those of you who may have been, have learned about cocaine or heroin, or it's basically any illicit drug. That high is no longer as good as the first time, and so you seek more of it out, and that's part of the addiction cycle. The same thing applies with our pleasures. All right. And you can, if you think and reflect back, you can think of examples of where you are craving more and more. And this includes stuff like money. Think about when you were a child and you were happy when you got $5, $10 for your birthday card, right? But then now, if someone gave you $5 or $10, you may not be as happy as you were when you were a child. Or compare yourself to when you were in high school or college. You didn't have a stable job that paid that much, but you got by. You were pretty happy. And now there are people who are, maybe some of you here, who if you don't make a certain amount of money every year, you're kind of upset with yourself. And you want more. And you find your value as an employee by getting that raise, getting that bonus, getting that next job that will pay you more. And so that wanting more and more can be a source of discomfort, a source of suffering. Getting the money is not the issue, is not the problem, is not what makes it unwholesome. Having lots of money is not unwholesome. It's what Buddhism is focusing on is the thoughts and feelings surrounding money that can be wholesome or unwholesome. Are you wanting more? Are you wanting to, oh, I'll be happy when I become a millionaire? All right. So that's part of the becoming, and I'm going to put that one on hold. I'm jumping ahead. So back to the sense pleasures. I think I'll leave it at that. I could go in more, but I don't want to. I think I can go more deeply at a later time. So just what you want to be aware of is how are the first step is just being aware of when you're feeling pleasure and how are you reacting to those feelings of pleasure. Okay. Now, the next craving was craving of becoming. And I kind of alluded to this when I talked about I'll be happy when I become a millionaire. So this idea that you have an urge to become this or that rather than being okay with who you are now. It's when you're anticipating the next moment rather than being in the moment. And I'll give you a good example of this. Watch yourself when you're eating, or maybe watch someone else while they're eating. A lot of times we're preparing the next bite, we're cutting the next piece, or we're scooping the next bite of our fork, before we've even finished chewing the food in our mouth. So what happens there is that we're already anticipating the next moment, and that anticipation of the next moment robs us from being able to be in the moment now, of savoring and really enjoying where you're at now. So that's part of the suffering caused by the craving to become, right? A craving for the next moment. We forget that the next moment is just as impermanent as the moment we're in now. But somewhere in our brain, we have this belief that the next bite will be just as good or better. And we don't take the moment to relish and savor the bite we're in now, we have now. We focus on not having enough money, and we rob ourselves from the gratitude that comes with appreciating what we have now. Now, it's not wrong to want a better job. It's not wrong to want more money. Okay? But there is a difference between what I would call aspiration versus expectation. And let me talk a little bit about that. When we aspire to something, or when we are inspired by someone, that gives us a direction of where to go. Okay? Think of when someone inspired you so much that you were so full of energy and you were just you had some clarity of mind, you knew what you wanted to do, and you started working on it right then and there. So you were very present in the moment, but that individual inspired you, gave you some direction as to what you wanted to achieve or be, and it had a direct influence on the here and now. And you were focused on being a fuller expression of yourself in the here and now. As opposed to expectation, which is the hope that something will happen in the future and then fearing that it might not happen. It's the expecting that I will be like Buddha, or expecting that I will be like Jesus, and not being inspired by them. And so being inspired by them would be, I want to reach my fullest potential like Jesus and Buddha. Remember, Buddha was never a woman. Jesus was never a woman. Buddha and Jesus were never Latino or Asian. Jesus and Buddha were never American or Russian. They could not be everything. And so they were an awakened version of themselves, of what they were born into. And so for us to want to be like the Buddha or become like the Buddha or become like Jesus robs us from the expectation or the inspiration that we can become awakened and still be ourselves. So the desire to be like Buddha, to become like Buddha, is unwholesome. It does not inspire us. It places our happiness being conditioned on achieving that Buddhahood that Gautama Buddha achieved, or that awakening that Jesus achieved. But when we're inspired by them, when we're inspired by a leader, when we're inspired by a historical figure, what they do is seem to call forth in us something true, something. If we want to be a better version of ourselves, we want to actualize who we are to our fullest potential. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, I will go in more deeply in future talks, but the idea of becoming something else or anticipating the next moment takes us away from the present moment and creates more suffering. So let me briefly then cover things that we can do to overcome these type of cravings. Okay? One is become more mindful of it and aware of it that it's happening. So the first step is to simply just be mindful of when you're feeling pleasure and why and what are the effects of that. Or when you're craving something, when you're really desiring something, take some time to reflect on that and analyze that and study it, be curious about it. And if it happens afterwards, then reflect back on it. But that's part of mindfulness, is starting to become more aware of it. Be more mindful of the difference between what we need and what we want. And so one of the things I will talk about in the future is that we human beings have a habit of miswanting. And this is researched. We have a habit of wanting the wrong thing, things that will not make us happy, but we somehow think they will make us happy. So I will talk a little bit in the future about miswanting and how that's associated with our suffering. Remind ourselves of impermanence. And I've talked about impermanence in the past. You can find the recordings of past Dharma talk on that. Remember that impermanence helps us be realistic. This pleasurable experience will not last. At the same time, impermanence of where we are right now can increase gratitude. So remind yourself of impermanence. All right, I'll skip this part. So let me just wrap up. In short, desires are very complicated. The object of our desire in and of itself may not be healthy, unhealthy, good or bad. It's what we're doing with the feelings and the thoughts surrounding our desire that can create suffering or happiness. And in general, when we're pulled away from the present moment and expect the satisfaction to be coming, that's in general when we start to create some elements of suffering within us. So what you want to do is to desire to be more fully you. Don't desire to be Britney Spears. Don't desire to be Barack Obama. Don't desire to be Buddha. Desire to be fully you. And because you can be fully you in multiple ways, right? You know how to do math, you can write a research paper, and you can probably garden, but you don't do all three at the same time. So when you have those options of what can fully mean, seek out inspiration or aspirations. um, rather than the expectation of becoming something or someone else. Another general thing you will find throughout this is you want to seek the solution to your suffering within. Very often, we are seeking our solution or our happiness without. That piece of cheesecake, that Mercedes, that Tesla, that vacation, um, those things, we're seeking those things out to make us happy. And when we turn out towards for our happiness, we tend to suffer. So seek for it, seek the solution to your suffering within. All right. In the future talks, I would like, if there's interest here, to delve more deeply into each of these sections. I know it was I didn't go too deeply into any of them, but again, it's a very broad topic. So what I'll do is I will delve more deeply depending on the type of questions I get here or requests. But I hope that that overview of desire gets you thinking about your own desires and cravings and how there's simply never enough. And so that's the beginning of that enlightenment. When you can start saying, you know, it's never enough. So what else can I do? That's how you start. That's how you start to get a reduction in your suffering and an increase in the amount of peace in your life. Thank you. So I'll just open it up now to any questions, comments, thoughts, whatever you'd like to discuss.
Sorry for coming in late, folks, but I finally found my way. But I want to make a little shout out to Rebecca and crew there. I see you guys are online with us today, so really great to see you, so to speak.
Cheers. Great to see you too.
We had a question here. Is having Buddha nature different from being a Buddha? Depends on how you define Buddha. So the term Buddha means awakened one. Buddha nature alludes to the fact that we are all capable of being awakened. So we're all capable of being Buddha. If you are saying, can we become the Buddha, as in Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha Buddha? No, we can't become them. And that's part of the craving of becoming that can be problematic. But when we crave desire to be more fully awakened, to tap into our Buddha nature and become awakened or Buddha, then yes, that's something that we can achieve. And depending on which school of Buddhism you aspire to or study, some discuss a very quick, instant awakening that happens, and others discuss a more gradual awakening, a gradual enlightenment. And many will discuss also how you'll have moments of enlightenment. So it seems, at least from my perspective, this is not my opinion. My opinion is that everyone experiences enlightenment and awakening in different ways. And so that's part of the reason we cannot allow ourselves to be saying, I want to be like the Buddha. No, I shouldn't want to be like anyone else. I should want to be an awakened version of myself, a more fully expressed version of myself.
Okay.
And that will be different for every person. There's a really great analogy. There was this man who was in retreat, and he noticed that he just wasn't getting into the retreat the same way everyone else was. And he felt like he was just a failure at the retreat. Everyone else seemed to be having these great enlightenments and great insights. And just there's this peace about it. And he's not getting it. And as he's slowly walking around the garden, he notices that some of the flowers are in full bloom. Some of the flowers are just buds about to bloom. And some of the flowers are just now breaking through the surface of the ground. The flower doesn't compare itself and say, why am I not blooming like those other flowers? Each of us will bloom at our own pace.
I have a question. So you know how you said there's like different degrees of desire, like I absolutely must have it is like on the extreme or whatever, versus it'd be nice if I had it, XYZ. Is that true for like the opposite too of like not wanting something like I can't stand for XYZ to happen, or I'd prefer it didn't, but I'd survive type of deal?
Yes, very much so. So that would be the perspective of aversion. So what the Buddha describes is this push-pull within us. There's attachment, which is where we are trying to grasp and want more of, and there's aversion where we try to push away. So what you're describing would be the mirror concept, but for aversion as opposed to desire. So yeah, that's a really good insight.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest parts for me, because I guess for a long time I was just thinking, well, if I just didn't want anything ever, I would just be really happy. But yeah, I guess it makes more sense and more logical. I mean, it's just more realistic to just have things and want them less in a reasonable manner. So to me, that was a really big point that resonated for me.
Good. And I wanted to focus more on that varying intensity of desires, but I think I'll make that a separate talk, because I too at some point also believed that all desires was bad. But once I realized that it's not about the desire itself, it's what you do with that desire that can be wholesome or unwholesome.
It's a balance, right? It's a balance. So it just makes me think of Gautama. You know, when he became an ascetic, he went to the point of forsaking everything except maybe a grain or two of rice a day, right? Going to the total extreme. And he was suffering there, and he said, well, what's the deal? So then he kind of realized, well, I'm a human being. Human beings have to eat. That's normal. And so I think that's what really attracts me to Buddhism so much psychologically, is that it, you know, it's just this middle way thing just really is appealing, because you have all, you know, you've got aversion and attraction and all these things pulling on you. And to be somewhere in the center, I think, is good, right?
And for many of us, including myself, who are suffering from post-traumatic church syndrome, you know, we were raised to be very averse to certain things that we called sins, and to desire only certain things, the things that were holy. And that duality creates a lot of potential for suffering, as opposed to a more balanced approach where, hey, I have both within me. I have yin and yang, black and white, good and evil. That this duality it doesn't exist. It's not real. It's a convenient way of thinking, but the reality is more complicated than that. And that's what Buddhism starts to try and open our minds to, that it's about achieving a balance between these desires and and aversions, as opposed to trying to chop off artificially these things that are part of who we are.